en forma separada. Sin más, entonces los dejo junto a Fernando Alvarado, que nos va a introducir más en el equipo de Windward Observer y iniciaremos la presentación. Muchas gracias nuevamente por estar con nosotros esta mañana.
Bueno, muy buenos días a todos y a todas. Muchas gracias, Macarena, y muchas gracias a la Cámara Chileno-Alemana de Comercio e Industria por esta gentil invitación. Como Windward Observer también estamos muy contentos de poder participar en esta presentación, charla sobre temas que creemos son muy importantes para, yo creo que lo que va a suceder probablemente el año 2025, ¿no? Entonces, la charla que vamos a dar es el nuevo gobierno de Estados Unidos y su implicancia económica y geopolítica tanto en Chile como en Alemania y en el mundo, ¿no? Entonces, la pregunta es, ¿ahora qué? ¿No? Entonces, quiero presentar a quienes van a exponer, que va a ser en primer término Markus Jaeger, que es académico adjunto de la Universidad de Columbia. Él es advisor de Windward Observer Consulting, nuestra consultora que nace el año 2023, a mediados del 2023, y la verdad que estamos muy contentos con lo que ha sido nuestra presencia y análisis tanto en la banca de inversión, universidades, y bueno, y ahora también incluso vamos a entrar a los bancos centrales. Después tenemos a Felipe Sandoval, que va a hacer un comentario, una suerte de análisis sobre un tema específico muy interesante que ha pasado ahora, que tiene que ver con el acuerdo que logró Mercosur con la Unión Europea, que ha salido muy poco en la prensa en este momento en Chile, y también un resumen final, digamos, ¿no? De cuáles son los temas interesantes y que de alguna forma nosotros como consultora también analizamos y ofrecemos para empresas. Y bueno, sin más, bueno, yo Fernando Alvarado, partner de Windward Observer y profesor de la Universidad de Adolfo Ibáñez. Así que ahora quiero dejar con ustedes a Markus Jaeger, que va a hacer la presentación número uno, que va a ser en idioma inglés, y Felipe después la presentación número dos, que va a ser en idioma español. Y posterior a eso va a estar abierto para que ustedes puedan hacer todas las consultas que tienen convenientes y las vamos a ir respondiendo. Así que, muchas gracias. Adelante, Marcus.
Great. Thank you very much, Fernando, and thank you for the thank you to the chamber and for all of you for attending this talk this morning. As Fernando was saying, there's a lot of geopolitical risk out there. Just yesterday, I went over the news and just sort of plugged some random news items. You can see here, China's economy is in crisis or is on the verge of a crisis, which of course in the current geopolitical context is even more worrisome given what the US administration has in store for China. You look at the potential for disruption coming from the next US president in terms of Greenland and Panama and Canada. I'm not saying all this will materialize, but you can see how the most important country in the world is once again becoming a potentially destabilizing factor for geopolitics. And then another topic that's perhaps of more interest to this group is Europe is looking very weak right now, economically and politically. France is in political turmoil. Germany is in political turmoil. The economic growth outlook is very bad. And again, if you contextualize this and look at this from a geopolitical point of view, you see two of the three largest economies in the world, China and the EU, being in a bad economic state, but also, at least in the European case, being in a vulnerable economic position. So there's a lot of potential for disruption over the next, not just months, but years, I would. The next slide, please. And I just want to start us off with the major geopolitical hotspots, which I won't get into much detail today because I think they're somewhat less relevant to a Chilean audience. But one is clearly first and foremost on Europeans' minds, and also I would argue Americans' minds, is the war in Ukraine. We're not quite sure where this is going to go. Right now, it certainly looks as if Russia has the upper hand. We don't exactly know what the US administration wants to do, though I'd be happy to talk about this based on what I'm hearing out of Washington in the Q&A. But clearly, this is of major concern for the Europeans, of course, because the collapse of the Ukraine would have all kinds of geopolitical and economic implications. And it should also be of concern to the American government, But there, I guess we'll have to see how this goes. But more broadly, you just see a ramping up of tensions between Russia and Europe and Russia and the transatlantic alliance over the past few years. And this is a problem that's not going to go away. So I think it behooves us to think about what this might mean, not just for the next few months, but what it might mean for the next year or two, economically, politically, and what potential it has to destabilize not just Europe, but the world, quite frankly. Next slide, please. The next slide, please. Well, either way, the next slide is on the Middle East. So I'm not even going to go into what is going on there. You've seen the news. There's a lot of change in the Middle East. There's a lot of violence, of course. There's a lot of potential for risk. I mean, just thinking back to last year, you've seen Israel and Iran trading blows, right? Sending missiles, targeted killings, and all the rest of it. So there's a significant potential for further problems. And now, of course, with the US administration coming in, and when you look back at the last Trump administration, they took a very, very hard stance vis-a-vis Iran. And Iran also is economically in a vulnerable position. So there are all kinds of possibilities here. But more broadly, you just have a lot of uncertainty, a lot of instability, not to mention Syria, not to mention Israel, not to mention the Houthis and trade and all the rest of it. So there's a lot of issues here that could also create real problems because, as you know, after all, the major oil producers are in the Gulf and Saudi Arabia. Now, I'm not suggesting that Saudi Arabia itself is at any potential risk, but the entire region is in flux, and there's a lot of moving parts. And Iran, I think it seems to me, is sort of the most important aspect of this. So we'll have to wait and see what the administration does. But there's a lot of there always have been a lot of tensions in the regions, and this could certainly deteriorate over the next few years. Certainly something that we should keep an eye on if we worry about the global economy. The next slide, please. And then, of course, as you will see in a moment on the next slide, if you will, the 800-pound gorilla in the room is China-US relations. That's something that has been with us for a long time. I would argue it goes as far back as Obama, perhaps even before. And I have a lot of thoughts on this, but I don't expect this to be a major issue in the short run, at least in the security sphere. But what you do need to acknowledge is you have a rising China, and you have a United States that wants to defend the status quo. So essentially, you have the clash of a revisionist power in terms of its demands, in terms of participation in the global economy and the global security system, and you have the United States that wants to maintain its position in not just in the region but globally. And what we've seen over the past, again, at least going back to Obama, an increasingly national security focused stance on the part of the United States vis-a-vis China. And at the same time, we've seen China taking you can argue, defensive offensive stance. Offense defense is often in the eye of the beholder, but you basically seeing the US and China setting themselves up for a clash. And once again, under Trump, it's very difficult to say what exactly the administration is going to do. What I can tell you is that if you look at the personnel decisions, when you look at who's going to head the State Department, who's going to head the National Security Council, these are China hawks. So I do not expect a major shift when it comes to US security policy. And I also don't expect a major shift on the Chinese side. So, I'm not suggesting there's going to be a major geopolitical crisis where all of a sudden, like US naval vessels confront Chinese naval vessels. But this is in fact a structural conflict, and there's always a potential for things to go wrong. I'm much more concerned about the economic sphere, and I'll say a few words about this later on. Anyway, that's just a long-winded way to say that there's a lot of political risks out there. There is Ukraine, first and foremost, then there is the US-China conflict in the Middle East. But I want to talk today more about issues that are of perhaps greater concern to you. And I think first and foremost, when we look at what will change over the next 6, 12 months, 1 to 4 years, is we have to consider the possibility of a significant shift in US economic policy. Now, at this stage, it's difficult to say how exactly this will play out. You've all heard about the tariff threats and the protectionist trade policy. At this stage, that's rhetoric. I'm not saying there's nothing coming our way, but it's not quite clear how exactly this will evolve. Will it be threats, and then the targets of those threats will sit down and negotiate, which is much of what happened during the first Trump administration? Or is it going to be more like a US-China dynamic during the first Trump administration, where the US administration really put on very, very high tariffs on China? We're not quite sure yet, but what I can tell you is that this has a significant risk to disrupt things economically. And even if nothing major happens in the end, and I'm not saying this is the baseline scenario, but if nothing happens in the end, there's still a lot of uncertainty about the outlook for US economic policy and what it means for the rest of the world. And just very broadly, I'm not going to get into this much in detail, but a stronger dollar and higher interest rates are typically bad news for emerging markets and developing economies. And at this stage, I would argue it's also bad news for China and Europe. So you have this economic divergence, which, of course, from the US perspective is somewhat welcome because it puts the US in a stronger bargaining position. Having said that, not everything is disruptive that comes out of the US over the next few years. You will have a drive towards deregulation. You already have very buoyant equity markets. You have a lot of economic confidence, a revival in economic confidence in the United States. You'll have most likely an expansionary fiscal policy, which will be good for short-term economic growth, though there's the question mark over what happens to debt over the medium term. And I think there will be continued tech leadership. On the part of the United States, there will be more resources going there. There will be deregulation. There will also be national security-focused tech restrictions, which is something we can come back to if you're interested. We just recently saw the Biden administration in its last week impose further restrictions on export controls, which really distinguish between G7 and close security allies, and then others. And then the third group is really antagonists, and they will not have access to certain types of US technology. On the other hand, for the US, the question marks here are trade policy. Now, protectionism is generally a bad idea, but if the US goes for protectionist policies, it will, at the margin, be much worse for the rest of the world than it will be for the United States for a range of reasons, including that the US is far less trade dependent. US immigration policies will also be at the margin negative for the US because you reduce labor supply. Again, I'm not saying that Trump is going to do what he says he's going to do, but this also has a potential for disruption. And so again, you get a stronger dollar, higher interest rates. People are now even talking about potential rate rises on the part of the Fed over the next few years, given the strong economic data. But what we will certainly see over the next few years is a continued relative outperformance of the United States vis-a-vis Europe. Not so much vis-a-vis China in the sense that China generally grows 4 to 5%, but in relative terms, the US will be doing much better compared to, say, like the past 5 years. And there's some serious question marks about where the Chinese economy is going to go. The main concern, though, I think it seems to me, has to be Europe. Just this morning, the German Statistics Office released the GDP data for 2024. What you see here is an IMF forecast. So the expectation as of October was zero growth in Germany. Following a contraction of 0.3% in 2023, in fact, the data for 24 came in at minus 0.2%. So this is pretty unprecedented in post-war German history, that you have 2 years of an economic contraction. And as you can see here, the IMF was looking at 0.8% growth for 2025. This may also turn out to be somewhat optimistic, really depending on what happens in the US. And also, of course, and I'll get to this in a second, what happens in Germany and the elections. But what you broadly see is, and just to go down the list, right? You look at Germany, you look at France, you look at Italy, we're looking at growth of around 1%. And that's a fragile 1%, I would argue. Not least because the Europeans are much more vulnerable to tariffs, for example, or other kinds of US measures than the US is. So there's a real potential for disruption, particularly for Germany, of course, which is the most trade-exposed country in the euro area. Compared to the United States, where growth is going to probably come in at 2%, I would not be surprised if it comes in slightly higher than this, because recently we've seen a fair amount of strong economic data coming out of the US. So you see this divergence in terms of performance. The next slide, please. And the other major thing I think we need to keep an eye on, again, this has more medium-term implications, is what I talked about early on. This conflict between the US, or this competition between the US and China, this is not going to go away. Yes, there might be a cyclicality to it. Maybe Xi and Trump meet and there's some sort of agreement of some sort. But structurally, genetically, if you will, in terms of the DNA, in terms of how international politics works, we're not going to see any sort of major reconciliation here. In fact, if anything, the conflict is going to intensify, particularly in the geoeconomic space. Again, I'm not forecasting any major military confrontation between the US and China, though I am forecasting continued security competition. When you look at Chinese nuclear forces, for example, you look at the construction of a blue water navy, when you look at the US response, there's clearly competition has been going on for a long time and it will continue to intensify. But what I'm fairly confident about is that we'll get further geoeconomic measures coming out of the US. And I'm not going to bore you with this. This is sort of like an economist sort of discussion here, but just sort of give you a sense, because it might impact you as well, what we might be seeing. And we've been seeing this, again, for the past few years, but we'll probably see further tariffs on imports into the US, targeting China, but perhaps also other parts of the world. We'll see the more intense use of export controls. Again, just yesterday, day before yesterday, we saw the Biden administration limit the export of certain types of chips. We'll see further restrictions in inward and outward investment in the United States, particularly in critical infrastructure and technology. And here the big question is always like, to what extent will third parties be affected? And the answer here is it depends, and I'll be happy to speak about this in the Q&A, because it's not that many of these measures simply target China. They also, by extension, target potentially third parties. And that's particularly true for financial sanctions, of course. Not all financial sanctions are primary sanctions that just target one entity. But as you know, the United States can use the dollar in a secondary way, whereby by imposing restrictions on a targeted counterparty, it prohibits third parties from dealing with this particular party. So by no means, if you sit in Chile or Germany, can you say, well, that doesn't concern me. Depending on the circumstances, it may very well concern you, because it will restrict or even outrightly prohibit your dealings with a specific targeted party. And of course, that creates risks for the global economic outlook because of fragmentation, because of uncertainty. I would also argue it creates risk for the global economic outlook because China is in a very vulnerable economic position, structurally and cyclically. And therefore, if there were to be a significant conflict, then it's quite possible that Chinese growth will take a further hit. And as you know, China is the most important trading partner for a lot of countries, not just in Latin America, but around the world. So a further slowing of Chinese demand and Chinese economic growth, if it were to happen in the context of, say, a tariff war, would also hurt third parties, particularly in commodity exporting countries around the world, and that would most likely include Chile. Next slide, please. Now, the arrival of the new administration, and I guess we are just a few days away from the president-elect taking office, will, I think, lead to much worse transatlantic relations. I don't think there's going to be a breakdown, but there's a bunch of things that are on the agenda and that have been an issue for the US side, and particularly for the Republicans, and more importantly for the MAGA Republicans for a long time. One is Ukraine and who funds the defense of Ukraine. There's been a lot of criticism of the Europeans, a lot of pressure on the Europeans to increase not just defense expenditure, but to increase their support for Ukraine. And this is going to be an issue because this is not just a financial problem. It's also a problem of, yes, you might have the money, but where do you get the material from to send to Ukraine? And here, of course, yes, it is to some extent a financial issue in the sense that Europeans could buy this from the Americans and then ship it to Ukraine. But my point here is, without going into details, there's a lot of issues here that need to be sorted out in the transatlantic relationships. But it's very clear to me that the pressure on the part of the US will increase, and they will want Europe to do more. And this is going to prove contentious politically, and also financially. Some Europeans don't have that much wiggle room, and I'll say a few words about this in a second. And then beyond the security sphere, there's, of course, issues, and I'm going to go into this, is tariff policy. There's still the steel and aluminum tariffs that Trump imposed during his first presidency, they're still on the agenda that could lead to issues. There's the issue of the international tax agreement, digital taxes. There is CBAM, so that's the environmental tariffs that the Europeans are thinking of introducing. There's the Airbus-Boeing dispute. There's a bunch of transatlantic trade disputes that could be easily used, or I should probably be more neutral, saying they're on the agenda and they will create problems in the transatlantic economic relationships. Not to mention financial sanctions and export controls, which, as you probably know, the US is quite capable in certain areas of imposing export controls and making them binding for third parties, which is what we saw last year or the year before when it came to semiconductor exports, and where the Dutch came around and supported US controls, perhaps against their wishes, just because they didn't have much wiggle room there. So my whole point here is the transatlantic relationship will come under increasing pressure. There will be a lot of contentious this year on the agenda on security and on the economy. And, I don't want to call this ideology, but you've probably recently seen Elon Musk attacking certain sitting governments in Europe, in the UK and in Germany and elsewhere. I think that also potentially will fuel further populism in Europe. So again, this will undermine European unity, not just the pressure coming from the US, but also this ideological shift in the United States towards populism, towards, I guess you could call it, well, whatever you want to call it, libertarianism, whatever you want to call it. But this is going to lead to increasing tensions between the two parties. And in that sense, could also fuel further fragmentation, certainly further concerns about the durability of the transatlantic relationship. And this, of course, happens in a context where you really have a true leadership vacuum in Europe. The two largest EU economies, France and Germany, are not are they just not doing well economically, but there's a lack of political leadership in the sense that, as you know, there are elections next month in Germany. There's going to be a new government coming, and we're not quite sure who this is going to be. It's going to be a conservative-led government, but it will be a government that has to be in a coalition with either the Greens, the Social Democrats, or both. So it's not quite clear that you will get the kind of reforms that you need. And in France, of course, we are now down to our sixth prime minister under the Macron presidency. And Macron has 2 more years to go. And we have all kinds of fiscal and financial problems, which again, I'll be happy to talk about. But so you're looking at those two economies in a situation where they are really quite vulnerable economically, and where there's a lack of political leadership and there is limited unity in Europe. Just to mention one thing, you have, of course, the Hungarians and the Slovaks pulling in one direction. Then you have Meloni of Italy going to Trump right away to Mar-a-Lago. So I think there's a real concern in Europe that the increased US pressure will lead to division instead of unity. And so this talk about strategic autonomy that we've seen over the past few years is probably not worth much. And so that Europe will find it difficult to defend itself. I'm not saying it is not going to stand up, but it is in a really vulnerable position. So I think it will come around and negotiate. But again, this itself will probably prove disruptive. Okay, next slide, please. So what you see on the next slide is really the economic outlook for Germany, as I mentioned, is pretty weak. This is even data. So let me take a step back. Even if things go well in Germany, as you see on the right-hand side, the growth potential is just at best about half of what you have in the United States. Again, Germany is not Europe, but the entire Euro area has a much lower growth potential than the United States. In the short term, because of the policies that I just outlined, but also structurally, Europe faces demographic headwinds, it faces a regulatory burden, it faces division, it faces to some extent, or it's dealing with a lack of unity politically, and most importantly, it lacks leadership. And I would argue, particularly coming out of Germany, because Germany is the one country that has enough fiscal space, and of course, it's the most important country in Europe that could potentially push forward the agenda. But this is not something that we are likely to see over the next few years. So if you're factoring in economic growth in Europe versus the US, I think it's pretty clear to me that whatever happens in the US will be doing about like twice as well as Europe for the next few years. You might argue, well, US economic growth is to some extent fueled by fiscal deficits. That's true. But the fiscal situation in Europe is not in the US is not necessarily much worse than it is in France. So either way, the US has more wiggle room to finance those things and is just more geared towards higher economic growth than Europe. Moreover, the German economy doesn't just face like domestic political uncertainty, which may diminish somewhat after the elections in February, but it faces this issue of energy dependence. It has to rework its economy. It depended to some extent on cheap energy exports. So there's a lot of structural change happening in the German economy, whereby energy-intensive companies invest abroad or elsewhere because the costs are too high, energy costs are too high. And not to mention the Inflation Reduction Act that was passed by the Biden administration, which creates incentive also for many German companies and European companies to invest in the US rather than in Europe. I mentioned the geopolitical challenges. This is also an issue that certainly needs to be taken into account when doing business in Germany, and the domestic political challenges I've just lined out. Now, what could happen after the elections in February? We'll have to wait and see. I think it's almost certain that you will get a conservative-led coalition government. The question will be, is it going to be with the Social Democrats, the Greens, or both? That we really don't know. We'll have to sort of see how the current polling translates into the distribution of seats. I do think this will bring, relative to the past 4 years, a reduction in political uncertainty. The Conservatives have put forward a reform program. Two thoughts on this. One is it's not particularly aggressive and radical, because I guess they have to win the elections, and you don't win elections by saying we're going to cut Social Security benefits. And of course, once they are in a coalition, they'll have to negotiate some of those as well. So don't expect a Thatcherite or Reaganite reform push in Germany in 2025, but we will probably see further progress towards some types of reforms. One is certainly deregulation. Another maybe is the debt brake, which in my conversations with like German corporations is an issue because in part they don't invest. Yes, energy costs are high, but in part they don't invest because growth is slow. Why is growth low? Because to some extent there's not enough demand and there's not enough investment. So loosening the debt brake would allow for further investment and further economic growth. But that requires constitutional majorities. I'm not saying you can't get them with a social democratic conservative government, but it's not quite clear to me. On this one, I'm sitting on the fence. I'm not sure what's going to happen. But what I can tell you, if they do loosen the debt brake, it's not going to be a radical reform. And yes, it will support the economy, but not radically so. But there's maybe some hope that they will do some reforming on this front. Next slide, please. And I just want to sort of end and sort of hand it over to Felipe by saying one of the better news coming out of Europe in the past few months was the final agreement with Mercosur that has been in the workings for years and years and years. And I do think that part of why this deal got done, and Felipe can talk about this much more knowledgeably than I can, part of the reason why this deal got done is simply because the Latin America, or Mercosur in that instance, and the Europeans, they know that we are in for like a much choppier global economic and political environment, particularly on the trade side. So what better deal can you get in terms of trying to diversify your international trade? In fact, lowering trade barriers so you get access to like third markets, so you don't rely too much on either the US or China. Now, this is not going to be transformative overnight, but it will help at the margin. And I think, and I'll leave it at that, it shows you the potential that third parties other than the US and China have to cooperate. Again, this will not insulate them completely from international pressure and from the potential uncertainty that we'll be facing over the next few years. But at the margin, it's sort of the right path to go down on to reduce the risks related to what I think is going to be a period of significant uncertainty and even potential disruptions in the next 4 years. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to Felipe.
Muchas gracias, Marcus. Quiero introducir a Felipe. Bueno, como ustedes, algunos entraron más tarde, Markus Jaeger, una de las personas que es de la consultora, es profesor adjunto de la Universidad de Columbia, fue director de Deutsche Bank durante muchos años y es doctor en economía de la London School. Y bueno, se refirió a uno de los temas principales que la consultora trabaja, que es riesgo político y geopolítico, y contextos económicos y mercados financieros internacionales. Y ahora Felipe va a aterrizar en algo que también nosotros nos dedicamos, que es evaluación del impacto de normativas en negocios e inversiones, respondiendo, como siempre Felipe lo hace, a la pregunta, ¿cómo afectan los cambios normativos a mi empresa o a mi sector? Entonces, ese es el tema que Felipe generalmente es experto y Felipe es académico y especialista en política comercial y análisis regulatorio. Felipe fue representante de Chile ante la Organización Mundial de Comercio años atrás y también fue negociador de tratados de libre comercio, entonces conoce bastante bien del tema, obviamente, tanto de una mirada académica, pero también como una mirada profesional, ¿no? Él es abogado de la Universidad Católica de Chile y tiene un LLM en la Washington University en San Luis. Felipe, por favor.
Gracias, Fernando, y gracias, Macarena, por la invitación. Eh, y claro, lo que recién dijo Marcus tiene mucha razón, es bastante lógico. En un mundo con mucha novedad desestabilizadora, este nuevo acuerdo, o versión revisada de un antiguo acuerdo entre Mercosur y la Unión Europea, es una buena noticia. Es una buena noticia y es una noticia que de alguna manera va en contra, o aparentemente en contra, de lo que sería el ciclo político global. De ahí que hemos titulado la presentación Mercosur-Chile un acuerdo contracíclico. El objetivo de esta presentación es que al final de la presentación, que es bastante breve, eh, ustedes puedan decir, sí, efectivamente es contracíclico, es decir, que sea tan evidente eh, que no haya que darle más vueltas a esta idea que es bastante poderosa. Eh, la siguiente slide, por favor. Lo primero es un poco de contexto, o sea, ¿de qué estamos hablando? Eh, el acuerdo Mercosur-Unión Europea es un tratado internacional que se comenzó a negociar hace ya más de 20 años, casi 25 años, por ahí por el 1999, 2000, y que en principio se había cerrado, se había concluido eh, en el año 2019. Lo que sucedió, es decir, ¿por qué no se suscribió en ese momento? Es que a propósito de la entrada al poder del presidente Bolsonaro en Brasil, eh, hizo mucho ruido el tema de la deforestación del Amazonas y de la falta de un impulso desde el gobierno brasileño para evitar esta catástrofe. Y eso obviamente gatilló presiones políticas e intervenciones en Europa que terminaron por detener el avance legislativo de este acuerdo. Entonces, este acuerdo en principio estaba cerrado. Eh, Sin embargo, se detuvo por ahí por el 2019. Entonces, el acuerdo que estamos viendo hoy, esto que se suscribió a principios de diciembre, el 6 de diciembre, es en realidad una versión algo mejorada de ese antiguo acuerdo y que incluye disposiciones específicas en torno a evitar la deforestación y le pone una fecha. La fecha que acordaron las partes, UE y en este caso Mercosur-Brasil, fue año 2030. Esto en un marco regulatorio en que existe también un capítulo específico sobre comercio sustentable que va a quedar vinculado a un sistema de solución de diferencias, es decir, un capítulo que va a tener dentadura, que va a poder ser exigido eh, por alguna de las partes que piense, que sienta y que está acompañada por los hechos de que la otra parte no está cumpliendo con el acuerdo en este tema tan sensible, no solo para Mercosur y la Unión Europea, sino que para el destino del planeta. Eh, en cuarto lugar, este acuerdo entre la UE y Mercosur es bastante similar en estructura a lo que Chile tiene con la Unión Europea. Es decir, es un acuerdo primero político, que tiene una parte política, ¿sí? Luego tiene una sección o parte sobre cooperación internacional. Este es todo el mundo de la cooperación interagencias, de cooperación entre universidades, entre entidades científicas. ¿Sí? Y la tercera parte de este acuerdo de asociación es la parte económica o acuerdo de libre comercio entre la Unión Europea y el Mercosur. Eh, Algo también importante mencionar o de dimensionar es justamente el tamaño de las economías que están involucradas. La siguiente lámina, por favor. Cuando hablamos de Mercosur, tenemos que entender que Mercosur es un bloque, Argentina, Brasil, Uruguay, Paraguay, de aproximadamente 270 millones de habitantes, ¿sí? Comparado con Estados Unidos, que son 350 millones, o con la Unión Europea, que son prácticamente 450 millones. Es decir, el Mercosur es más o menos en población la mitad de lo que es la UE con sus 27 miembros. Se trata, Mercosur, de una gran economía en sentido agregado. Está, dependiendo del ranking que uno mire, localizado por ahí por el número 6 a nivel mundial en términos de PIB regional, con 2.2 trillones de euros, que al día de hoy son prácticamente lo mismo en dólares. Eh, lo que implica que es un séptimo del tamaño de la economía de Europa. Es decir, que sin perjuicio de su gran tamaño, de su gran gravitación, Europa sigue siendo mucho más grande y más rica que Mercosur. Eh, este es para la Unión Europea, bueno, también para Mercosur, pero en primer lugar para la Unión Europea, el esfuerzo de integración económica más grande de su historia, aparte o dejando fuera los mismos esfuerzos que construyeron a la Unión y al mercado común. Este es el acuerdo de libre comercio, por decirlo de esta manera, es uno de los más importantes de los últimos 30 años, desde la creación de la Organización Mundial del Comercio. Eh, y es de esperar entonces que tenga un impacto significativo. La siguiente, por favor. ¿Qué comprende este acuerdo de libre comercio o tercera parte económica de este gran acuerdo de asociación entre Mercosur y la Unión Europea? Básicamente comprende lo que en la jerga más técnica se llaman los pilares fundamentales del comercio internacional, que son básicamente cuatro. El comercio de mercancías, ya mercancías agrícolas o no agrícolas o industriales, el mundo del comercio de servicios, es decir, de los intangibles, la propiedad intelectual, que en el caso de la Unión Europea es básicamente abrogar por un sistema de protección de las indicaciones geográficas, eh, y el mundo de las inversiones recíprocas o de la inversión extranjera. Estos son los pilares fundamentales del comercio internacional que están también comprendidos por este acuerdo. Y adicionalmente, entre otros temas, pero estos son los más importantes, este acuerdo UE-Mercosur tiene un capítulo específico o disposiciones específicas que están vinculadas al comercio de las materias primas. Ahora, esas son disposiciones que hay que leerlas en conjunto con otras. Es importante el negocio en torno a las materias primas en la medida en que tenemos reglas para los inversionistas, en medida en que tenemos normas técnicas, sanitarias, fitosanitarias, en la medida en que tenemos rebajas o eliminaciones arancelarias. Y obviamente, siempre en tándem, en conversación, en equilibrio, con el comercio sostenible o sustentable, que es un tema políticamente sensible en Europa y que ha venido ganando importancia también en el mundo sudamericano del Mercosur. Siguiente, por favor. Rápidamente, y para que tengamos una idea de lo que puede ser el impacto de este acuerdo, e incluso pensando desde la perspectiva, por ejemplo, de exportadores chilenos. Cuando miramos al mundo arancelario, el arancel es la suerte de impuesto que se impone a las mercancías que importamos. Eh, Cuando miramos a este esquema, obviamente tratándose de un acuerdo entre dos partes. Mercosur y la Unión Europea, de manera independiente, asumen compromisos de o eliminar aranceles a los productos que importan, o de reducir, o de eliminar con un cierto plazo. Entonces, en términos generales, cuando se trata de bienes industriales, es decir, de todas las mercancías que no son agrícolas, la UE se compromete en principio a eliminar los aranceles en 10 años. Y el Mercosur elimina aranceles en más o menos el mismo tiempo, pero un poco más rápido, y para el 90% de sus exportaciones hacia la Unión Europea. Eh, por ejemplo, y estos son temas que probablemente le interesen a más de algunos. Hoy, los autos europeos que entran al mercado brasileño entran con un arancel del 35%. Este es un arancel que se va a eliminar por parte de Mercosur. Y en el mundo de Mercosur sabemos que el mundo arancelario automotriz es realmente importante para Argentina y para Brasil. En el mundo de la maquinaria y los farmacéuticos, el arancel único de Mercosur es 18 o hasta 18 y hasta el 14% respectivamente. La siguiente slide, por favor. Ahora, si miramos a los productos agrícolas y en particular al acceso de productos agrícolas europeos que entran al Mercosur. Fíjense ustedes lo que sucede con el vino. El vino europeo hoy día tiene un arancel del 27%, es decir, una sobretasa, una tasa de importación del 27% del valor del producto, lo que obviamente lo hace mucho más caro, y lo hace mucho más caro que el vino chileno, siendo que Brasil, por ejemplo, es un muy importante destino de exportación de vino. Y esto quiere decir que el vino europeo va a volverse mucho más competitivo en relación al vino chileno. No quiere decir que Chile vaya a vender menos vino, pero sí quiere decir que el vino europeo va a ser mucho menos costoso y que por lo tanto el comportamiento del consumidor es probable que se modifique y que toda la energía, todo el gasto que se hacía, por ejemplo, en vino chileno, ahora tenga que quizás distribuirse, o que en ciertos segmentos de producción de vino, la Unión Europea, a propósito de esta rebaja arancelaria, se vuelva mucho más competitiva. Y así sucede también con otros productos, con los espirituosos, es decir, todo lo que no es vino, quesos, chocolates, etc. Esto también obviamente tiene una contrapartida, es decir, exportaciones desde Mercosur hacia la Unión Europea. Y aquí lo que ha hecho la Unión Europea es básicamente decir, mire, hoy, por ejemplo, Brasil y Argentina, pero sobre todo Brasil, exporta muchísima carne al mercado europeo, alrededor de 170.000 toneladas. Y lo que ha dicho Europa, o a lo que se ha comprometido Europa, es decir, mire, y esto también para apaciguar un poco los ánimos de los agricultores europeos que estaban muy preocupados. Es decir, de ese total, tomemos aproximadamente la mitad, que es una cuota de 99.000 toneladas aproximadamente, y a esas primeras 99.000 toneladas le vamos a dar un beneficio arancelario, o sea, terminando, eliminando completamente el arancel o reduciéndolo. De esa manera se impulsa, se promueve una suerte de comercio libre y regulado, pero al mismo tiempo se toman en consideración aspectos políticos o de política comercial económica al interior de la Unión Europea que de no respetarse o de no considerar en la negociación de un acuerdo como este, podrían terminar finalmente con la posibilidad de que este acuerdo sea aprobado en Europa, porque la agricultura es uno de aquellos temas en que los Estados miembros aún tienen, entre comillas, poder de veto o tienen una voz mucho más fuerte al interior del sistema europeo. La siguiente, por favor. Adicionalmente a estos ejemplos, es importante mencionar que este acuerdo bilateral, eh, por ejemplo, en términos de indicaciones geográficas, que es el mundo de la propiedad intelectual y que está vinculado a el origen geográfico de un producto, que está vinculado a un nombre, a una cierta forma de cultivo o de elaboración, por ejemplo, champaña. Desde que nosotros firmamos el acuerdo con la UE, hablamos del espumoso, ya no hablamos más de la champaña producida en Chile, sin perjuicio que químicamente puedan ser similares, eh, y que la champaña chilena puede ser muy buena, le llamamos espumante. Bueno, en este caso, la Unión Europea logró consolidar un sistema de 350 indicaciones geográficas en este acuerdo bilateral con Mercosur, lo que lo convierte en el acuerdo con más indicaciones geográficas, al menos al inicio, que la Unión Europea ha podido negociar con cualquier otro país o bloque económico. Otros aspectos importantes son la estabilización, es decir, compromiso a no empeorar en el futuro de las condiciones regulatorias en materia de comercio de servicios, en particular servicios financieros, en particular servicios de transporte y de telecomunicaciones, y estabilización normativa en cuanto a la reglamentación que afecta a las inversiones, es decir, inversión extranjera, legislación que afecta a la legislación o regulación que afecta a la inversión extranjera, no podrá ser empeorada en el futuro y debe ser transparentada. Es decir, cuando nosotros revisamos este acuerdo, podemos ver en gran medida los términos bajo los cuales una inversión europea se puede realizar en Mercosur, en términos de acceso al, al mercado. Y otro tema importante que la Unión Europea ha negociado con otros países y que es importante destacarlo, porque en los tiempos corrientes donde hay tanta ansiedad frente al fenómeno migratorio o cuasi migratorio o simplemente al hecho de que extranjeros entran o salgan de mi territorio nacional, la Unión Europea y el Mercosur han negociado un marco de facilitación para el tránsito, para el movimiento de manera temporal, es decir, entrando y saliendo, de personas de negocios de ambas partes. En particular, o con especial acento, en aquellas personas que ya trabajan por una empresa europea, por ejemplo, o brasileña, y que necesitan viajar al territorio, ya sea de Brasil o de la Unión Europea, a prestar un servicio y volver. Un servicio que ha contratado la empresa para la cual trabaja, pero que quiera asegurarse que efectivamente su personal pueda movilizarse, ir y venir sin mayor dificultad. Siguiente, por favor. Ahora volviendo un poco al principio y comenzando a cerrar la presentación. ¿Por qué hablamos de que este es un acuerdo contracíclico? Y la idea original era que ustedes solos pudiesen darse cuenta lo evidente que es contracíclico. Después de haber escuchado a Markus y todas las banderas rojas que levantó, rojas y amarillas en el mundo, guerra, inestabilidad política, alza del dólar, encarecimiento del endeudamiento, encarecimiento de las rutas comerciales marítimas. Ahora está todo el tema de Panamá, que ha surgido de nuevo. Chile es el cuarto, quinto usuario del canal de Panamá. Eh, este mundo convulso, este mundo incierto, en el que los aranceles vuelven a tomar un lugar muy importante, muy preponderante en la política económica o la política comercial mundial. Esto que desde el año 47 se ha venido facilitando, hemos venido sacando aranceles, hemos venido reduciendo aranceles, aplanando la cancha. Resulta que ahora, al concluir el primer cuarto del siglo XXI, vuelve a ser un tema fuerte, poderoso y peligroso para los que quieran hacer negocios, porque lo encarecen. Esto implica obviamente un debilitamiento de este principio fundamental sobre el cual está construido el sistema de normas internacionales y muchas veces los sistemas de normas comerciales al interior de los países, que es la no discriminación. Es decir, tratar al extranjero igual que al nacional, aplicándole la misma regla, y en segundo lugar, no discriminar a este extranjero, tratar de igual manera al brasileño, al argentino, al norteamericano o al japonés. Estos principios están bajo presión, bajo tensión. Como ya lo mencionamos, alza sostenida del dólar. ¿Por qué? Porque a mayor incertidumbre, y esto Marcus lo sabe muy bien, la moneda de refugio sigue siendo el dólar, y por lo tanto hay menos dólares disponibles, lo que obviamente le da su valor, y que repercute en, por ejemplo, países como Chile y las economías emergentes en general, que están endeudados, obviamente en dólares. Quiere decir que nuestra deuda es mayor a la que era la semana pasada. Y en Chile lo sabemos muy bien, con un dólar alrededor de los 1.000 pesos. Y otro factor que, sin perjuicio de esta buena nueva que hemos estado conversando, es importante considerar es que las condiciones políticas y económicas, pero sobre todo políticas en Europa, están cambiando. Y eso significa que de pronto los apoyos tradicionales a una política de integración regional económica de la Unión Europea puede que no tengan la misma fuerza. Entonces, si bien esto ha sido una gran noticia, una muy importante noticia, al 6 de enero, o sea, al 6 de diciembre, eh, no sabemos todavía cómo se va a desarrollar exactamente esta conversación a propósito de la aprobación final de este acuerdo bilateral entre la UE y Mercosur al interior de la Unión Europea. Hay un espacio de incertidumbre, eso es lo que quiero decir. Siguiente slide, y creo que es la final. No, esto creo que ya lo conversamos, así que vamos al final. Perfecto. Entonces, adicional al trabajo que hace Markus, ¿sí? Adicional al análisis de los efectos de los grandes eventos geopolíticos que pueden tener impacto o no en la economía local o en la relación de una economía local como Chile con el resto del mundo, ¿sí? En adición a esto, en Windward estamos dedicados también a poder asistir a inversionistas, a personas de negocio, en la navegación que tienen que hacer a través de los sistemas regulatorios. ¿Por qué? Porque muchas veces la persona de negocio sabe muy bien lo que vende, lo que tiene, y cuán competitivo puede ser, sobre todo cuando se trata de hacer comercio con otros países, conoce muy bien su potencial demanda, pero o no conoce, o conoce a medias, o no entiende el tránsito a través del sistema regulatorio de ese país donde está mi consumidor, o incluso en el país donde quiero formar una empresa. Entonces Windward ahora puede asistir a los inversionistas y a las personas que hacen negocios en esta parte, en el análisis regulatorio. En el análisis regulatorio de las regulaciones que existen y también de las que podrían existir. Es decir, ir anticipándose a cambios regulatorios. Y eso significa anticiparse ante posibles dificultades. Fernando, creo que he hablado lo suficiente. De nuevo, gracias a ti, gracias a Macarena y obviamente abiertos a recibir preguntas.
Perfecto, no, muchas gracias Felipe, muchas gracias Marcos, colegas en Windward Observer. Ahora dejamos abierto unos minutos para preguntas a Felipe o a Marcus o a ambos con respecto a los temas que hemos planteado. Entonces dejamos abierto el chat para preguntas de las personas que están acá conectadas. Sí, tenemos a Juan Enrique Gómez Besser.
Hola Fernando, hola Marcus, hola Felipe, gracias por la presentación, muy interesante. Tengo dos preguntas, una para Marcus y una para Felipe. Marcus, my question to you. You talked a lot about the dollar being strengthened due to uncertainty. Are Bitcoins a way around dollars right now? I mean, I see Bitcoins like a kind of currency that is increasingly getting more important even among governments like El Salvador, for example. And I wonder if this would be also a strategy for other people to follow in order to get around the increase of the value of the dollar?
Should I? Yeah, let me take that one first. Thank you for the question. I think I'm skeptical in the sense that, well, let me take a step back. It depends on what you want to use Bitcoin for. If you want to use it to transact, trade, to sell and buy, I don't think it's a very useful way of doing this, because for a start, the value of Bitcoin fluctuates massively. And on a grand scale, I'm not holding my breath that this will somehow replace the dollar. Then I think there's also the issue of regulatory scrutiny. If you engage lots of Bitcoin transactions, how this is perceived by, say, local regulators or foreign regulators. So to use Bitcoin to transact trade, I think is going to be very difficult, simply because there's a lot of uncertainty about the value. And at the end of the day, if you transact at a very large scale, I don't see, and I could be wrong on this, major companies using Bitcoin instead of the dollar. Yes, the dollar has become more expensive. There's all kinds of issues with it, but there's simply no alternative. And I would just, if you allow me to add one more thought to this, there's often a lot of talk about the dollar being replaced by the euro, the dollar being replaced by the RMB. Yes, we're seeing more and more, for example, RMB, like the Chinese currency, being used in Chinese foreign trade with its major partners, but we're not really seeing it as a really convertible party that third parties can use. So for now, the dollar is still dominant, and for better or worse, the world is stuck on the dollar. So really, to answer your question, I think Bitcoin for trade transactions, to me, seems not a really viable proposition for most companies, simply because the risk and uncertainty and the regulatory scrutiny that comes with it is very, very high. So I think we are again, for better or worse, we're going to have to deal with the dollar for the foreseeable future, really.
Thank you very much, Marcus. Y mi pregunta para ti, Felipe, el acuerdo de Mercosur con la Unión Europea, ¿dónde ves tú que le va a pegar más fuerte a Chile? Yo veo, por ejemplo, que mencionaste a modo de ejemplo lo que va a pasar con los vinos, los espirituosos de Europa que se van a abaratar. Pero también al bajar los aranceles, todos los productos de Mercosur hacia Europa también se van a abaratar, y eso puede también ponerle presión a los productos chilenos. No sé si tú ves ahí en particular algún riesgo más específico para los productos chilenos.
Gracias por la pregunta. Mira, por ejemplo, el vino también, el vino argentino, que ya es muy competitivo en Europa, sobre todo porque el vino argentino está muy segmentado, o sea, los argentinos exportan vino muy caro. Nosotros exportamos mucho más vino que Argentina, exportamos 4 o 5 veces la cantidad total de vino. Pero el vino argentino tiene más margen, porque el vino es mucho más caro, y ahora va a ser bastante más barato. Ahora, yo creo que ese es un poco el primer análisis. El primer análisis es siempre mirar, es decir, bueno, la ventaja automática o de corto plazo es la eliminación o la reducción del arancel. Pero si uno pone la lupa encima, el arancel en realidad es, entre comillas, el más sencillo de los análisis, el más fácil. Después hay que ver si cumplen hoy los argentinos y los brasileños con requisitos sanitarios y fitosanitarios europeos, estándares que son distintos. Ellos los cumplen en ciertos productos, por ejemplo la carne. Y nosotros no competimos en realidad con la carne brasileña en Argentina, en Europa. De manera que esas reducciones arancelarias, o sea, hay muchas de ellas que no son inocuas a nosotros, simplemente porque son espacios que los productos chilenos no ocupan, porque no competimos con ellos en eso. Sería mucho más preocupante, por ejemplo, si Brasil hubiese negociado un acuerdo con China o con ASEAN en que tiene preferencias arancelarias para el pollo. Porque Chile es un gran exportador de pollo al mercado chino, por ejemplo, con arancel cero, y si eso se equipara con otra potencia productiva en términos agrícolas como Brasil, eso sería un problema para nosotros. Ahora, en términos generales me parece que es una muy buena noticia esto que Mercosur y la Unión Europea hayan negociado un acuerdo, porque esto genera convergencia regulatoria. Es decir, eh, el Mercosur va a tener que modificar, va a tener que adaptarse, va a tener que acoplarse al sistema regulatorio europeo, en servicios, en bienes, en SPS, en obstáculos técnicos, eh, eh, en materia medioambiental. Y esto es un esfuerzo que Chile ha venido haciendo ya hace mucho tiempo, eh, y que es palpable. O sea, esto no es un discurso vacío. Por ejemplo, miren a la ley de responsabilidad extendida del productor, la ley REP en Chile. Eh, es casi una copia de los estándares europeos. Miren ahora la última revisión de la ley para la protección de los datos personales. O sea, es legislación europea. La convergencia hacia Europa es muy clara. Entonces, el hecho de que Brasil, Argentina, Uruguay y Paraguay vayan convergiendo hasta ese mismo sistema, de alguna manera no solo facilita la relación de ellos con lo europeo, sino que nuestra relación también con el Mercosur. Y Mercosur es para nosotros un mercado súper importante en bienes y en servicios. O sea, en servicios es el primer mercado que tiene Chile, por ejemplo.
Excelente, muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Juan Enrique, por tu pregunta. Tenemos una pregunta acá que se hizo a través del chat, lo hace eh, Yolfran León, que con respecto a Venezuela habrá una repercusión económica en la región sudamericana ahora que Trump asumirá un nuevo periodo presidencial, es decir, ¿cuánto puede afectar la mirada de Trump a Venezuela? ¿No? Quizás ahí Felipe pudiese mencionar algo, o Marcus.
I'd be happy to have a stab at it. So let's go back to the first Trump administration. Like, it was fairly hawkish on Venezuela, but it didn't go all in. So there were sanctions, increasing sanctions, not all that different from what we saw under the Biden administration, but there was a certain degree of hawkishness vis-a-vis Venezuela. I'm not sure that the recent elections in Venezuela make a big difference in terms of how the US perceives Venezuela. I think it is strategically important from the US perspective. There's the oil aspect, there's the aspect that Venezuela is sort of more leaning towards potentially Russia and China, but is certainly sort of a bit of a pariah in the region. Um, and I think importantly in that respect is the fact that Marco Rubio will almost certainly become the next Secretary of State. He is, of course, someone who knows Latin America very well, as senator from Florida. He's always taken a very keen interest in South America, including Venezuela, and has been quite hawkish also on human rights. I'm not so sure how well the rights aspects will fly with the White House and the Trump administration more broadly, but I do think that he himself he's not going to fundamentally change. There might be some run-ins with the White House and some of those issues, but he will, I think, broadly take a hawkish approach to Venezuela. The question, of course, is what can the US do? What is it prepared to do? Generally speaking, I would say the US is much more concerned about Ukraine, right? This is either the hotspots we talked about. The Middle East, yes, we saw the ceasefire agreement sort of coming into not to force, but being negotiated and agreed on. But there's a number of hotspots that are far more important, and I think China is far more important than Venezuela. But to the extent that there is room, I do think that the current administration will, at least rhetorically, ramp up the pressure against Venezuela. The key question, though, is what can you really do? I mean, a lot of major players are sanctioned. Yes, I guess there's still some American companies in Venezuela that you could somehow like get them to like not be as active there. That's my understanding at least. So I think there's still room to ramp it up. The question is to what extent this runs into like oil market constraints. I think at the same time, if you're sitting in the White House, you don't want to have too much disruption there in case it sort of indirectly affects global oil markets. And that's a separate question of to what extent this could happen and so on and so forth. But broadly speaking, I would expect the rhetoric to become much more hawkish. And I also would not be surprised if there were increasing measures targeting Venezuela. But the key question, of course, is would it really make a difference to Venezuela? How strongly established is the regime? And these things are very, very difficult to forecast. You know, we missed the Arab Spring, we missed the end of the Cold War. We're missing these phase transitions many, many times. And of course, quite frankly, a lot of people sitting in North America and Europe, we don't really know all that much about Venezuela because we don't go there. We don't really have that many local contacts. But it seems to me, as for now, there's no indication, at least, that there's a major threat to the regime. The only threat I can see is that perhaps the military sort of swings the other way for reason A, B, and C. But I'm also not so sure how likely that is. So, there's a possibility that the Trump administration might seek to reach out and not target, but sort of get the military to sort of move. But I'm not sure that this is particularly likely in the short run. So anyway, long story short, I think the pressure will increase. There will be increasing sanctions, but it's not quite clear what these sanctions will do. And there's a real question of how effective they will be in effecting regime change in Venezuela. What I will say, though, if there were to be a regime change and a democratic transition, this would have a significant impact in the medium term when it comes to oil markets, when it comes to the role of Venezuela in the region. Even just economic reconstruction in Venezuela would probably reduce a lot of pressure on outward migration, which is also affecting Chile and other countries. So this would be a huge thing. It would probably be a huge win for the Trump administration. But as of now, I see little evidence that we are going to get there in the near term.
Perfecto, muchas gracias, Marcos. Tenemos también una pregunta de Juan Esteban Montes, que es el director de la Universidad de Notre Dame en Chile. Juan Esteban, gran amigo, gran colega.
Muchas gracias, Fernando. Gracias por esta excelente iniciativa y presentación. Gracias, Felipe y Marcus. No, Marcus, ¿entiende español para formular la pregunta en español o se la formulo en inglés?
No, está bien, está bien.
Ok, gracias. A ver, una pregunta tal vez un poquito fuera de lo que has presentado, pero tú y todos vemos, ¿no?, una crisis de liderazgo político en Europa, ¿no? Y lo has planteado así y sabemos que hay incertidumbre. ¿Cuáles crees tú que son las causas de esa crisis y eh, cómo ves que la Unión Europea, los distintos países de la Unión Europea están enfrentando o podrían enfrentar ¿cuándo vamos a poder ver una cierta evolución y hacia dónde en esa crisis de liderazgo en la Unión Europea? Los distintos países, especialmente Alemania y Francia, obviamente, pero más general también.
Thank you for the question. That's a very big question, so I'd probably need about 2 hours to really go into the details here. But I would say, broadly speaking, there seems to be a pattern across Europe, and I would even include North America to some extent. You're having issues like migration that seems to be a very emotional issue for a lot of people. Rightly or wrongly, we can debate this, but the perception is certainly there. More recently, we've seen things like inflation. What's interesting, by the way, just as an aside, virtually all major advanced democracies have seen a change in government over the past few years since COVID. So this isn't perhaps not so much an issue of left versus right, but the incumbents lost because inflation was seen as a major problem. I follow this quite closely in the US, where it's really, really interesting because inflation was a major concern in the elections. But at the same time, economic confidence was very much a function of partisanship. So the day Trump won, Republicans became very optimistic about the economy, which as an economist makes me think, how important are these indicators we are looking at? But to answer your question, I think migration is an important issue. There's this debate to what extent globalization and pressure on wages is an issue. I think that is perhaps more important in the US, where we have seen globalization put downward pressure on wages of less well-off blue-collar workers, particularly in the Midwest. And US policies to some extent reflect this. No one's going to run for president on a pro-liberalization, let's liberalize steel imports agenda, because that means they will lose, or they think they will lose, the Midwestern states and can't become president. So I think it's to my mind, it feels a lot of this, and that's perhaps more true in Europe, is this sort of cultural agenda that plays into it. The people on the right, they don't like woke. The people on the left like woke. They don't like traditional values. But I do think migration has a lot to do with it. And then maybe the sense of economic stagnation. But again, I want to be a little careful there. But there is certainly a sense among like blue collar workers, which interestingly actually have shifted from the left to the right in many cases and to the far right. There's a lot of concerns there. And then I think thirdly, it's just this overall issue of national sovereignty versus globalization. I guess most of us in this room, we are sort of globalized elites and we look at global issues and we are quite comfortable getting on a plane, flying somewhere, speaking English or other languages. This is not necessarily true for all countries. And I think there's this real antagonism between, or this perceived antagonism between the quote unquote elites and parts of like the less well off parts of the economy. And this is what the battle is about. And this is exactly why Trump's message is so powerful, right? It's a very emotional message. It's saying everything is bad, which is actually not true when you look at it. But that's what people believe, particularly the ones who support him. And when you look at this, the shift is very clear, particularly in the US. You see better educated voters moving towards the Democrats, whereas the Democrats historically were the party of workers. And you see less well-educated older people who feel like they're not really benefiting from globalization, moving to the right. And then lastly, I think in very lastly in Europe, particularly in Eastern Europe, I think there's still this sense, and you see, by the way, interesting to talk about Germany, very interestingly there, you see the far right and the far left being far more powerful forces politically in East Germany, which used to be communist, than in West Germany. So there's also something about narrative and about how you deal with history. But you extend this to Poland, to Slovakia, to Hungary, you see these are much more potent forces overall over there, even though, of course, you also have Nigel Farage in the UK and have Marine Le Pen in France. So it's a bit of a global thing, but I think the resistance in the West is a little greater for a number of reasons. And so there's a sense that there's this globalization going on and our traditional way of life or our way of life is threatened by immigration, by globalization. And this, I think, why you have a sort of right-wing shift, which, of course, and I'll end with this, is a huge problem because it undermines governance in Europe. And if you look, for example, in Germany, you used to have like 3.5 parties. They used to form fairly stable governments. Now you have like 5 or 6 potential parties in parliament, 2 of which are, you can't really form coalitions with them if you're a centrist party. So it really restricts your coalition options and it creates less stable governments. And the same is true to some extent in France. I mean, Macron's gambit to like have elections just meant nothing. If anything, it weakened the center and you see this increased polarization. So I think cultural issues, migration, this perception that globalization benefits certain groups and not us, and this detachment that there's no sort of, they're not wedded, like the people who move to the right, they're not wedded to, they don't buy into the globalization narrative. In part, that's justified by looking at the economics. In part, I think there's not also an ideological component to it. But whatever the reason, I think it's going to be with us for a while, and it's going to continue to weaken Europe in particular, particularly where we have parliamentary regimes, but even in semi-presidential regimes like France.
Thank you very much. I don't know if I have time for another question, Fernando.
Okay. Muy bien, una pequeña.
Just I'm curious about what do you think, Markus, Germany needs to come out of its economic stagnation period? You know, what would German economy need to do to overcome this very, as you mentioned, no, strongest crisis in many years?
I think it's fair from an economic perspective, and I'm not sure politicians, well, they probably know, but they don't want to say it. I think it's fairly obvious what needs to get done at the national level. One is you need greater deregulation in a bunch of areas. And then you, at the same time, and this is sort of a perfect recipe for economists, you stimulate domestic demand. So, and Germany, as you know, is in a position where debt is very low, fiscal debt is very, very small compared to France, Germany, and Spain. There is enough space. So why not move resources, like finance resources in the markets? There is, I'm not saying you're going from 60% debt to 120% of debt GDP. But when I speak to German corporates, they say, look, we'd love to invest, but yes, investment is partly about regulation, but partly there's no economic growth. So why would we be investing in Germany? We're going to invest in the US that grows 2%, 2.5%, and where we get incentives. On the issue of subsidies, I'm not skeptical. I think you have to be very careful with those because they're not necessarily very efficient. There's a lot of rent seeking. But I would say you deregulate on the one hand, and you create demand to get the economy going. An economy that's been declining for 2 years in a row means there must be a lot of spare capacity unless investment really massively bombed. But even the investment you get up by getting the private sector to invest, but also you yourself, you need to start investing. And at a sort of metaphorical level or symbolic level, when you look at the trains in Germany, like I go to Switzerland a lot, and they say, "Well, can I get a ticket to Germany?" And they're sort of laughing, saying, "This is not really working over there." In Switzerland, it worked, so they must have done something right that Germany didn't do. And the answer to that question is, it might be regulation, but a large part of it is like Germany has not invested enough in the past few years, in part because of the debt brake. And again, I'm not saying you should have a major investment. We have to be very targeted, but you need investment to increase productivity, and you need investment to stimulate demand. And if you do this in the context of deregulation, then I think this looks pretty good. But the question is, will we get there politically after February?
Perfecto. Bueno, muchas gracias, Juan Esteban, por la consulta. No sé si hay una última pregunta o ya estamos en la hora. Bueno, como consultora Windward Observer, queremos agradecer a la Cámara Chileno-Alemana de Comercio e Industria y especialmente a Macarena Gallardo y obviamente a todas las autoridades, digamos, de la Cámara. Y doy acá las palabras finales a Macarena. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Fernando. Muchas gracias, Marcos. Muchas gracias, Juan Esteban, por compartir con nosotros esta información espectacular. Me encanta cuando se dan estas conversaciones entre socios, amigos de la Cámara. Son excelentes instancias y es lo que nosotros como Cámara promovemos entre nuestros socios y también amigos de la Cámara, como en el caso de ustedes, para generar instancias de aprendizaje y colaboración entre nuestros socios. Así que muchas gracias por esta estancia. Con esto nosotros en la Cámara yo creo que ya entramos en el periodo de receso de vacaciones, así que me imagino que vamos a tener, si es que hay actividades, van a haber poquitas, y si nos retomamos todos en marzo con mucha fuerza, en muchos eventos y mucha información para todos, así que ahí los esperamos. Nuevamente, muchas gracias a Windward Observer por darnos esta oportunidad hoy y que tengan un excelente día. Muchas gracias.
Gracias a ti.
Gracias a todos. Nos vemos.
Gracias, que esté muy bien. Hasta luego.
Muchas gracias. Excelente panel.
Juan Esteban.